Welcome to IVF This, episode 153, IVF and Prolonged Grief. Hello, 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 my beautiful friends. I hope you are all doing so well today, whatever day you're listening to this. So yesterday, as in yesterday of the writing of this episode, we had a solar eclipse in Austin where we lived in what they called the path of totality, which admittedly sounds very ominous to me and very end of the world. But we had a once in a lifetime experience of getting to watch and see a complete eclipse. So we laid out in the front yard with our eclipse glasses that you literally can't see out of unless you're staring directly up in the sun. And it was this very surreal experience for about 5-ish minutes or so. It was pretty dark outside, like even our outside lights came on. Birds stopped chirping, animals stopped moving. My two cats actually ran away right before it started. It was pretty amazing to witness. And then the next day we had a tornado warning for our area. So, springtime in Texas is super fun, always keeps you on your toes. But I thought that was really cool that I wanted to share that we got the chance to see a total solar eclipse. So I file that away in a happy memory for myself. But today's episode, I feel like I have wanted to talk about this for a while because I hear from a lot, like so many of you, that they feel so much like their personality, their lives have changed, sometimes pretty dramatically throughout the experience of infertility, loss, IVF. So that's what I want to talk about today. And I want to give you some language that might help you better understand what might be happening and why. So, we're going to talk about prolonged grief disorder. If you've never heard of prolonged grief disorder, you are not alone. A lot of people haven't. Most people haven't outside of the mental health space. And there's a little bit of controversy around the term and the diagnosis. And I might touch on it a little bit, but just know that it's not a perfect system. What I want to make abundantly clear as we start talking about this is I am not diagnosing anyone, and I am not suggesting that you need to go to a psychiatrist for diagnosis if this topic really resonates for you. The purpose of this episode, and actually most of the episodes that I do, is to help give you context and language to what you might be experiencing so that it doesn't have to feel so overwhelming. It doesn't have to feel so isolating, or frankly, so that you don't have to feel like there's something wrong with you. So it's not so much about identifying a potential disorder, but to understand that grief can stay with you and it can be very complicated. Like it often is very complicated. So I'm going to start by giving you just some basic information. And my hope is that if this term is new to you, and frankly, even if it isn't, that you come away from this episode using the idea of prolonged grief disorder in the most constructive and loving and compassionate way possible. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what I mean by that as we go through, but let's talk about what it is, how it came to be, the basics, right? So, prolonged grief disorder is the new name for what used to be called complicated grief in a previous version or versions of the DSM. The DSM, if you're not familiar with that, it's not a problem, but it's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. Kind of a mouthful, obnoxiously so. But basically, it's a book for diagnostic purposes. The big book that clinicians and psychiatrists use to diagnose mental disease or disorder. Now, I'm not someone who uses this book anymore. I am no longer in the business of diagnosing anyone with anything. But it's important to understand that having a diagnosis is more essential for insurance coding, reimbursement purposes. In addition to the natural human need to classify and order things, that's a primary role of the DSM in whatever version we're talking about. So I understand why this book exists. I used it for a long time, but the DSM is this big book that is revised. It is a cacophony That's a great word. It is a cacophony of a lot of opinions. So to get something in the DSM, either a new version or a revised version, a text revision version, is a really big deal, meaning that it requires a lot of people, committees, public commentary. So the latest version of the DSM 5, has been in work since 2013, right? That was the year it was published. I think it was August of 2013. And then in 2022, there was a text revision that included some updated criteria, codes, all of that. And the version before that was published in 1994. So the DSM 4 was published in 1994. And a text revision of that was done in 2000. So you can tell by the massive gaps in time that the DSM is not updated often. And as you can imagine, any updates requires a lot of hands in the pie. Like I mentioned, a lot of committees, conferences, disagreements, compromises, so many opinions. And that is to say, all of that is to say that this book is far from perfect. It is far from comprehensive, but it is the guidebook for what we have. So I want you to bear that in mind when I talk about prolonged grief disorder. So what is it? It used to be called the previous version, DSM-4 version, complicated grief disorder. I actually kind of prefer that term because I think it encapsulates what grief actually is, which is a really complicated thing. But for some reason, I wasn't called up to give my opinion in the years leading up to the DSM-5 publication, which I find outrageous. But if you hear me either talk about complicated grief or prolonged grief disorder, just know that I'm using those words interchangeably, synonymously. The true definition or the true diagnostic term now is prolonged grief disorder, right? So just clarifying a few things. Now, I want to remind you that the definition of grief that I like to use is that grief is a natural human response to a perceived loss. Grief is not a disorder in its truest sense. Grief is a natural human response to a perceived loss. We were built to grieve. We are supposed to grieve. Grief is a normal part of being a human. So that is really important to understand. And sometimes, though, what happens is that with anything, that it doesn't always go in the best possible way, right? And what I mean by that is things interfere with healing, which is why I prefer the title complicated grief, right? Things get in the way of healing. Healing is not linear, right? An example from author Mary Frances O'Connor, who wrote The Grieving Brain. It's a fantastic book if you're like really into grieving, like if you're like a grief nerd like me. Anyway, she uses the example of broken bones. So if you break a bone, your body knows what to do with that broken bone. Your body knows how to heal a broken bone, but sometimes things get in the way. The bone sets and you get it casted. Sometimes something goes awry, there's an infection or something happened. And sometimes assistance can help get that healing back on track. And I really love this idea that it can just get complicated. And essentially, that's what complicated grief is for many of us. And I am overgeneralizing, so stay with me. But for many of us, we have an early acute experience of grief where it feels like our world fell apart and everything feels chaotic in our minds. For others of us, it can feel like a slow build, like there's grief on top of grief on top of grief. And so it's like a slow burn or a slow build into that chaotic feeling. Some of us have very intense brain fog and we can't think, we're numb, or we're really experiencing like abrupt mood swings. We go through that period of intellectually knowing that it happened or that it is happening, but not really understanding on an emotional level that it did or is continuing to happen. I'm thinking of things like pregnancy, child loss, cycle or transfer failures, like those sudden shocks that can make it really hard to function. You're literally in shock. And if you've been on this journey for a while with nothing, and it's that gradual build of shock, numbness, fog, etc., that starts to creep in. Both experiences or a combination of those experiences are completely valid. There is not a hierarchy here, okay? For most people, like 90-ish%, adjust to their grief. They integrate it into their lives. I talked about this in episode 150, IVF and Time Doesn't Heal. We don't stop grieving in the way that grief will always be a part of our lives, because the loss or losses always happened, and they're always going to have thoughts. We're always going to have feelings about that loss. And remember, that loss can mean anything that you feel is a loss, including the loss of how we expected our family building journey to look like. And sometimes, especially around like loss anniversaries or particularly meaningful days or holidays, you're going to feel more emotion around that loss than at other times, right? But for the most part, we get back to living. Grief is no longer interfering with our daily lives, our daily functioning, interfering on a daily basis because it gets integrated into our lives. Well, the idea of complicated grief, or now prolonged grief disorder, is that some people, and the diagnostic criteria, right, is a year or more has passed for adults, and they aren't able to live life without significant disruptions. Here are some symptoms of prolonged grief disorder according to the American Psychological Association website. Identity disruption, such as feeling as though part of yourself has died. A marked sense of disbelief about your loss or event or death, right? Remember, we can use all of those interchangeably. Avoidance of reminders, intense emotional pain like anger, bitterness, or sorrow related to the loss. Difficulty with reintegration, such as problems engaging with friends, pursuing interests, planning for the future. Emotional numbness, absence or marked reduction of emotional experiences, like feeling muted emotionally. Feeling like life is meaningless or intense loneliness, feeling alone or detached from others. In addition, the person's bereavement might last longer than might be expected based on social, cultural, or religious norms. Great. Now, what the hell do we do with all that information? Here's my hope. My hope is that if you relate to that, you will hear it and you will go, oh, okay. And you'll be compassionate with yourself, and you'll seek support from either a licensed therapist or a coach or something like that. And you will not shame or blame yourself. And you might feel this intense relief knowing that what you might be experiencing has a name. Now, I definitely hope that you will not use this information against yourself. I don't think you will. Hopefully you will not, because you're listening to this podcast after all. So that already tells me that you're aware enough to start separating yourself out from your emotional experience. Doesn't mean anything about you. But just in case, if this is the very first episode of IVF This that you have ever listened to, we're not going to use this against ourselves. Creating awareness is the goal. We don't want to take this and make it mean that grief in and of itself is a disorder. We want to take this information and go, okay, grief is very human and natural and normal. And there are these things that happen in grief, and it's different for every person. And there's no endpoint and there's no goal, but I'm not broken because I'm thinking and feeling this way. And I also don't have to live a life where my grief significantly impacts my quality of life. And that if that is the case, then support is available. That is what I really want you to hear. But I think you can imagine that for those of us who have been saying grief is not a disorder, grief is natural, grief is normal, stop making it wrong or bad, stop telling us to get over it, stop telling us to move on. That's not how grief works. There is no end point to this, right? If you've listened to this podcast, you have heard me say those types of things before. So you can imagine that those of us that talk about grief or have elements of grief practice in our work are kind of conflicted around this idea of prolonged grief disorder as a disorder, because we can see how many people can misuse or pathologize things. But with anything, it's not black or white, in my opinion, right? It's nuanced. There is value in this diagnosis and in this diagnostic criteria. There is a way to use it for good, and there is also a way that we can use it against people who are grieving, or we can use it against ourselves. And so let's live in the gray. Let's live in the gray area. Now, I've read different numbers, but it seems to be on average, people can agree that somewhere between 7 and 10% of adults will experience symptoms of prolonged grief disorder somewhere-ish around there, right? I've read 4, I've read 5, I've read 10, I've read 12. I feel like there's a lot of different numbers, so the numbers don't really mean anything anyway. But most people do not struggle with prolonged grief disorder. The majority of people don't, but some do. But that's people who would fall within the official diagnostic criteria. That doesn't mean that someone can't experience elements or traits. In mental health, we call this subclinical, right? Meaning you're experiencing symptoms, but you don't check all the boxes for an official diagnosis. Now, if you are interested and you want to learn more about it, maybe you have some questions around, maybe this is something that I'm going through, I would really, really suggest you go to prolongedgrief, all one word, .columbia.edu. And we'll have the link in the show notes, but it's the Prolonged Grief Center out of Columbia University, coincidentally enough. It used to be called the Complicated Grief Center, right? Or Center for Complicated Grief. I can't remember which one. But Dr. Kathy Shear is behind that center, and her work is fantastic, right? I love her website because for you, there is a section for individuals or the public, and there's a section for professionals. So if you want to learn more about it, or you're just interested or anything like that, I would highly recommend that you go to the website and click the public section. If you are not a mental health professional, do not go to the Professional Resource Center. It's probably going to be over your head and or not applicable to you specifically. The public access for information and resources is really where you should be. But one of the things that I really love about this website is that you can click on the public section and you'll see a quiz that you can take, a self-assessment tool, brief grief questionnaire, super easy to navigate. You can take it in, and literally just a couple minutes, you'll know if you are experiencing some elements of prolonged grief. Not necessarily all the diagnostic criteria for prolonged grief disorder. I want to make those two differentiating things very clear. Another reason I love this website is because not all mental health professionals have the same education as it relates to grief. And Dr. Shear has developed a very specific protocol for prolonged grief disorder treatment. And she has trained mental health professionals, and they work at various levels, right? But if you go to the website, you can click on Find a Therapist if you're looking for a therapist who understands prolonged grief disorder. You can sort and you can search by location. I believe you can tell the level of education that they've received as it relates to work done with the center, right? There is a minimum criteria. You have to be a licensed social worker, clinical social worker, LPC, things like that. But her list is specific to people who meet that minimum baseline and who have received additional training for prolonged grief disorder. And I feel like that is an incredibly powerful and empowering tool for you to be able to use. Because the last thing that you want to do is show up in someone's office if you want a good mental health professional who doesn't understand grief or who doesn't even know the term prolonged grief disorder. That's not going to be of service to you at all if you're needing that very specific type of support. So I like this for you as someone who can use this tool, find what you need, right? And then there's just a lot of information too that can help you gently help others in your life understand a little bit more about what you might be going through if this describes your experience, so that you can better support you, right? And that's one of the reasons that I love this website. That's one of the reasons that I do the work that I do, so that you can best support you. So that's what I wanted you to hear. We're going to use this information, this term, for good, not for evil. Grief is not a disorder. Grief is a natural, normal human response to a loss. But at a certain point, right, we just want to be aware, is it persistently interfering with your quality of life, and that you don't have to settle for that. We don't have to make ourselves feel bad about where we are in our grieving journey. We just want that more information. We want that additional awareness so that we can best support ourselves, right? We just have to know that it is not the only thing that's possible in grief is to stay stuck there. We want to know that it's possible to have more. And that is what I hope for each and every one of you. All right. That is what I have for you this week. Have a beautiful week, and I will talk to you soon. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of IVF This. If you like what you've heard, click subscribe and follow to make sure you don't miss an episode. And if you want to learn more, head over to www.ivfthiscoaching.com to learn how to work together.